It is January 897 AD. Inside the Lateran Basilica in Rome, the torches have been lit early, not for atmosphere but necessity. The basilica smells of old wood, candle wax, and rot. There is a man on trial, draped in papal vestments, but he is not speaking. He cannot speak, because he has been dead for over 7 months. His name is Pope Formosus, and he is currently propped up in a chair, tied upright with ropes. His skin is grey, his eyes are gone, his hands are curled into claws, and yet here he sits, dressed for court, presiding over the trial of his own corpse. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Society, where history's strangest tales are told slowly, softly, and just a bit unsettlingly. Think of this as your nightly descent into the archive room of reality, dimly lit, slightly damp, and filled with things you can't quite explain. If that sort of thing sounds like your cup of embalming fluid, consider subscribing. It keeps us digging through the weirdest footnotes of human history. And if you've heard of stranger trials than this one, drop it in the comments. But be warned, this one sets the bar unsettlingly high. So why is Pope Formosus recently decomposed back in public view? To answer that, we must turn to the man who brought him here, his successor, Pope Stephen VI. Stephen stands just a few feet away, jaw clenched, robe immaculate. He is flanked by cardinals and legal advisors, most of whom are attempting and failing to look anywhere but at the cadaver seated before them. Stephen is not here for decorum. He is here for revenge. This is not a symbolic trial. It is, in the legal record, an actual ecclesiastical court proceeding. The corpse will be tried for perjury, ambition, and violating canon law. A deacon has been assigned to speak on Formosus's behalf, a surreal pantomime like arguing with a particularly tragic puppet. The charges are read aloud, the defense is weak, the crowd watches transfixed, and then comes the twist. The outcome has already been decided. Stephen has no interest in justice. He wants humiliation, he wants erasure, he wants Formosus, even dead, to suffer. The verdict is already inked in some dusty scroll, waiting in the sacristy. This is not a trial, it's theatre. Absurd, decaying political theatre, but why? What could possibly drive a man to put a corpse on trial? Why dig up your predecessor, dress him in robes, and scream legal accusations at an empty husk? That's where the real story begins, and like all proper Roman tragedies, it starts not with justice, but with vengeance. To understand why a man would scream at a corpse in public, we must first understand Pope Stephen VI, a man so consumed by fury that it outlived the object of his hatred. Stephen was not born a monster. He was born a pawn. In the late 9th century, the papacy was less a holy office and more a seat in a very dangerous game. A chessboard littered with feuding kings, squabbling bishops and aristocratic Roman families, who saw the Vatican not as sacred ground, but as real estate. Stephen was elevated to the papacy in 896 under the patronage of one such family, the powerful Spolitans. At the time, being pope was a bit like being appointed CEO of a collapsing company, run by warlords and ghosts. You didn't last long, and you were almost certainly being used. And that's exactly what Stephen was. Used. By the Spolitan family, by angry bishops, by ghosts of popes past. But none of those things mattered as much to him as Formosus. Formosus had once been pope too, but long before that he had made enemies. Many of them. He had taken controversial political positions, shifted allegiances, and had the audacity to crown someone other than the Spolitan favorite as Holy Roman Emperor. That, in Rome, was practically a death sentence, which came in 896, when Formosus died suddenly, probably of a stroke, and was buried in peace for about 7 months, until Stephen VI, filled with a venomous cocktail of pressure and paranoia, came to power. The whispers had already started. Formosus was a fraud, a traitor, a perjurer. His ordinations were invalid, his legacy a stain on the church. Stephen took these whispers and turned them into fire. But here's the strange thing. By all accounts, Stephen wasn't a ranting lunatic at first. He was calculating, ambitious, even reasonable, which makes what he did next so chilling, because the Cadaver Synod wasn't the act of a madman spiraling out of control. It was premeditated. He had the body exhumed, had it dressed in papal vestments, had it propped up in court, had charges written, argued and read aloud. The ropes that held the corpse in place, not a last-minute fix. They were measured, cut, tied with ceremony. This was not an outburst, it was a performance, and Stephen was the director. What he hoped to achieve, no one knows for sure. Maybe it was political legitimacy, maybe it was revenge, maybe it was fear, that Formosis's ghost still loomed over the church, that the living could not move on while the dead still held sway. Or maybe it was something simpler. He wanted to break the spell, to prove through public degradation that death was not the end of justice, that he, Stephen, held power even over the rotting. But there's a danger in such theatrics. When you raise the dead to make a point, you risk raising something else too. As the trial unfolded, the church began to crack, not just spiritually, but physically. The people of Rome whispered that something unnatural had been awakened, and when the verdict came, the city itself began to turn. The punishment? The corpse was stripped of its papal robes. 3 fingers, the ones used to bless, were hacked off, and the body was thrown into the Tiber River. Justice had been served, but something darker had just begun. The corpse had spoken its last, or rather been shouted at for the last time. The verdict was handed down by Pope Stephen VI himself with a cruel theatricality. Formosus, already long dead, was declared guilty on all counts. The sentence, retroactive invalidation of his entire papacy. And then came the mutilation. Stephen ordered the 3 fingers used for blessing, the symbolic ones, to be cut from the corpse's hand, as if spiritual authority could be unstitched with a blade. The papal robes were stripped from the decaying body. The corpse, now naked and mangled, was dragged through the streets of Rome and thrown into the Tiber River like garbage. But Rome noticed. Rome always notices. For a moment, Stephen VI had what he wanted: revenge. The man he hated had been publicly disgraced. The political statement had been made. But something else had been made too, a spectacle. The people of Rome, already weary of papal corruption, began to whisper not about Stephen's power, but about his sanity. The spectacle had crossed some invisible line. Even in a brutal, faction-torn city, digging up a corpse to put it on trial felt off, and the whispers grew louder. Some said Stephen was possessed, others that he had been cursed by Formosis's spirit. Children told stories about a pale man in robes floating in the Tiber, silently blessing anyone foolish enough to look directly at him. Monks reported nightmares. One bishop claimed that his own hands had begun to rot, the same fingers Formosus had used to bless him. Was it hysteria? Perhaps. Rome was no stranger to madness, but it was more than superstition that brought the city to a boil. It was fear. Fear that if a pope's body could be desecrated like this, whose was safe? Priests began hiding relics. Bishops re-examined their ordinations, terrified they might be invalidated retroactively. The people began to murmur in church, to hesitate at the offering, to turn their backs on confession. Something sacred had been broken, not just a law but a boundary. And Pope Stephen, the orchestrator of this rot, began to lose control. His allies, the same Spoletan nobles who had once backed him, started to distance themselves. Other factions within the Vatican sniffed weakness. The trial, meant to solidify power, had instead unmoored it. And the smell of decay wasn't just coming from the river anymore. It was inside the palace. One night the Tiber belched up a corpse. It was Formosus, bloated, broken, and unmistakably intact. Fishermen found him tangled in reeds along the riverbank. They claimed he had drifted upstream, against the current. By morning, Word had spread that Formosus had returned from trial, returned from shame, returned from death, and Pope Stephen VI began to shake. He locked himself in the Lateran palace, that a pair of rotten fingers had appeared on his pillow, that Formosus was speaking to him, not metaphorically, audibly, and that voice, he said, was promising justice. Pope Stephen VI was unraveling. The Cadaver Synod, once intended as a masterstroke of political theatre, had become a curse he couldn't outrun. The trial was over. The corpse had been condemned, but instead of bringing peace, the spectacle had ignited something in the Roman people that refused to go out. Stephen's dreams were filled with water, always the same scene, a pale hand emerging from the river, fingers missing, blessing him silently. A voice calling from beneath the current, not screaming, not whispering, but chanting. Latin phrases he couldn't understand. Sometimes it was the voice of Formosus. Sometimes it was his own. He stopped sleeping. The Vatican, once a hive of scheming clergy and feuding nobles, grew strangely quiet. People avoided the Pope. Whispers now came with glances, and glances turned into mutinous stares. The very bishops who had applauded Stephen's trial began meeting without him. Rome, once afraid of Formosus's ghost, had found something even more terrifying, a pope who had lost his grip on reality. Stephen tried to issue a new decree, declaring that all bishops ordained by Formosus were now unordained. It was met not with obedience, but panic. Entire dioceses collapsed into confusion. Priests refused to perform mass, baptisms were paused, marriages annulled. If Formosus's papacy was invalid, then so were their sacraments. Stephen had not just exhumed a corpse, he had exhumed chaos, and chaos, once loosed in Rome, was not easily buried again. In the summer of 897, the people snapped. The uprising was not elegant, it was not symbolic, it was a mob, raw, angry, untheological. They stormed the Lateran palace. Some say Stephen tried to flee through a hidden passage. Others say he was found standing in the chapel, still in his robes, muttering scripture that had begun to loop in his head. He was imprisoned. The church, eager to restore normalcy, moved quickly. A new pope was installed, one who promised calm, who called the Cadaver Synod a distortion of justice. The Vatican issued orders, no more corpse trials. Formosus's name was to be quietly restored. His body, still decomposing from its river pilgrimage, was finally reburied in the tomb from which it had been stolen. But Stephen was left to rot. His cell was damp, his robes were taken. And in the final weeks, he spoke to no one, or rather, no one living. Guards reported strange sounds at night, wet footsteps, whispers in two voices. Then, one morning, it was over. Stephen VI was found strangled in his cell. Officially, it was suicide, but no rope was found, no cloth, no mark of resistance, just his body, slumped in the corner, mouth open, as if mid-argument, eyes wide, fingers curled. And on the wall behind him, scratched into the plaster with a fingernail, a single Latin word, redemptio, redemption. What did he mean by it? Was it a confession? A plea? We'll never know. But one thing is certain. The Cadaver Synod had claimed its second victim, and it wasn't finished. The story should have ended with Stephen's death. The corpse had been judged. The Pope who judged it had been judged in turn. Rome, at last, could breathe again. But history has a habit of keeping receipts. Over the next few years, the Church would try to scrub the Cadaver Synod from its record, to quietly pretend it never happened. The decree condemning Formosus was annulled. His papacy was posthumously restored. His mutilated corpse, now buried properly, was to be left undisturbed. The very idea of putting the dead on trial was officially declared an error. But errors have echoes. Stephen's successors didn't just inherit a throne, they inherited his paranoia. In rapid succession, 3 more popes would take the chair. All of them died mysteriously. One lasted 15 days, another barely a month. One was murdered in his bed. The papal throne became a cursed object, a seat nobody wanted the warm for too long. Behind closed doors, bishops began referring to it not as the chair of Peter, but the bleeding throne. And then something even stranger happened. In 904, under Pope Sergius III, a former ally of Stephen VI, the Church reversed its reversal. Formosus was condemned again. His ordinations were voided again. His legacy once more dragged through theological mud. It was as if the corpse had never been buried, as if it still haunted the Vatican halls. And maybe, in some way, it did, because while Rome kept trying to erase the Cadaver Synod from memory, it remained, in whispers, in bloodlines, in the secret libraries of the Vatican, where a few cracked pages still describe, in lurid detail, the day a pope placed a corpse on trial. And Formosus, he said nothing, never did, even as his name was blotted out, even as it was restored, even as it was cursed all over again. Because the real story of the Cadaver Synod wasn't about him. It was about what he left behind, a church forced to confront the absurdity of its own power, a pope so obsessed with authority he imagined it could reach beyond death, and a city, ancient, fractured, spiritual, that watched its leaders descend into something worse than heresy, spectacle. In the end, the true curse of Formosus was not that he returned from the grave. It was that he never had to. He had already won. His silence said more than Stephen's screams. His stillness made Rome tremble, and his corpse, paraded through court, became something eternal, a monument to the moment power turned on itself and lost. So the next time you hear someone insist history is boring, or tidy, or sane, tell them about the trial where the defendant was decomposing. Tell them about the Cadaver Synod. Tell them that once, in the holiest court in the world, a pope was out-argued by a corpse. If you made it to the end, you are now an honorary member of the Sleepy Society. Before you drift off, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another strange, slow, unsettling tale. And remember, history doesn't just repeat itself. Sometimes it rises from the grave.